The courtroom was already laughing. Judge Marshall Carter barely hid his smirk as he glanced down at the young man standing before him, another kid who thought he was smarter than the system. "Let's not waste time, son." The judge sighed. "We both know how this ends." The prosecutor chuckled. The jury barely paid attention. The case was already decided, but Xavier Reed didn't flinch. Because what none of them knew, what they never saw coming, was that this trial wasn't going to end the way they expected. Judge Marshall Carter adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the young man standing at the defense table. The Texas State Courthouse was packed, spectators, reporters, and local officials watching with quiet expectation. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made your skin prickle. Xavier Reed, 22, stood tall, his sharp brown eyes scanning the room, his hands steady. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting against a system that had already decided his fate. The judge's voice broke the silence, dripping with condescension. "Mr. Reed, let's not waste time. We both know how this ends." A few chuckles echoed. But Xavier didn't flinch. He knew something the judge didn't. This wasn't going to end the way they expected. Judge Marshall Carter leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood. His eyes, cold and uninterested, flicked over Xavier Reed like he was just another name on the docket, another young black man caught up in the system. "This should be quick," Carter muttered, flipping through the case file. "I've got a golf game at 2. A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. The bailiff, the court reporter, even the jury shared amused glances. To them this was entertainment. To them Xavier's future was a foregone conclusion. Xavier stood still, his chin slightly lifted, his expression unreadable. He wasn't some street kid caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had spent years studying law, not as a student in a classroom, but as a son listening to his mother, a dedicated public defender, break down case after case at the dinner table. He knew how the system worked, how it was rigged, how assumptions became facts, how juries made up their minds before trials even began. And looking at Carter, at the smirking prosecutor, at the jury that had already stopped paying attention, Xavier knew this wasn't about justice. It was about keeping the system running smoothly. Judge Carter peered over his glasses. "What? No defense, no argument." The spectators chuckled again. Still, Xavier didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let his face betray a single emotion. Because he wasn't here to play their game. He was here to change the rules. The moment Judge Carter shifted his gaze to District Attorney Samuel Brock, the prosecutor was already rising to his feet. He moved with the confidence of a man who had won this trial before it even started. His tailored navy suit was crisp, his tie knotted with precision, and when he spoke, his voice carried the smooth certainty of someone who had made a career out of sending young men like Xavier to prison. "Your Honor, the state's case is straightforward," Brock announced, pacing toward the jury, his hands clasped behind his back like a professor giving a lecture. "We have surveillance footage showing the defendant, Xavier Reed, exiting the convenience store just moments after it was robbed. We have witnesses who saw him running, and most importantly, we have his fingerprints on the store counter." A few jurors shifted in their seats. The words landed heavy, each one designed to paint Xavier as guilty before he even had a chance to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brock continued, turning to face the jury directly, his voice steady, rehearsed, undeniable. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all some grand misunderstanding, that Mr. Reed was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time." He let out a scoff, shaking his head. "But let's be honest, what kind of innocent man runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Xavier could feel the weight of their eyes, their assumptions pressing down on him like a slow, suffocating force. Judge Carter tapped his gavel lightly. "Sounds pretty clear to me." For most people in the room, it probably did. But Xavier had spent years studying trials, and even in the strongest cases, he knew exactly where to find the cracks. Xavier's public defender, Monica Lewis, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had barely spoken since stepping into the courtroom, her fingers gripping the edges of her notes like a lifeline. Everyone in the room could see it. She wasn't ready for this fight. Neither was Xavier, at least, not in the way they expected. As Judge Carter turned his gaze toward the defense, Monica hesitated, opening her mouth, then closing it again. Before she could speak, Xavier placed a hand on her arm. A silent request, a quiet moment of control. Then he turned to the judge. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The courtroom froze. For the first time that morning, Judge Carter actually looked at Xavier. His amused smirk faltered for a brief second, before returning, laced with even deeper condescension. You will what? Xavier didn't blink. I'll be defending myself. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. The jury exchanged uncertain glances. Even Samuel Brock, the ever-composed prosecutor, let out a short, surprised laugh. This should be interesting, Brock muttered, shaking his head as he sat back down. Xavier knew what they were thinking. Another young kid who thought he was smarter than the system. Another defendant trying to pull a stunt. Another case where the courtroom would get a good laugh before reality crushed him. Except this wasn't a stunt, and Xavier wasn't about to get crushed. He had studied this exact moment. He knew how prosecutors operated, how judges ruled, how juries made up their minds before trials even began. And now it was his turn to make them uncomfortable. Xavier took a step forward, adjusting his stance, letting the silence settle just a little longer, long enough to make them feel the weight of what was coming next. Then, finally, he spoke. Before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. A tense silence stretched across the courtroom. Judge Carter leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, watching Xavier like a cat, sizing up a mouse. Go ahead, the judge said, waving a dismissive hand. Xavier turned to District Attorney Samuel Brock, his face unreadable. You said Officer James Tanner personally witnessed me running from the store after the robbery. Correct. Brock exhaled sharply, already bored. That's right. Xavier nodded, his expression calm. And that testimony is written in his official report. Obviously. Xavier's lips curled into the faintest smirk. That was Brock's first mistake. Your Honor, Xavier said, turning back to Judge Carter. I move to dismiss Officer Tanner's testimony as evidence. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Judge Carter squinted. On what grounds? Xavier pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Because Officer Tanner wasn't even on duty when the chase began. Brock's smirk vanished. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. What are you talking about? Brock snapped. Xavier took a slow step forward, his confidence unwavering. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Tanner's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he saw me fleeing the scene, then his location data should back that up. He let the words settle, then added, but I have a feeling it won't. Now the murmurs grew louder. Judge Carter frowned, shifting in his chair. Counselor, he asked Brock. Brock cleared his throat. He was stalling, and Xavier knew exactly what that meant. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Xavier had just thrown the first real punch, and everyone knew it. Judge Carter's eyes narrowed as he looked over at Brock, who suddenly wasn't smirking anymore. Well, Counselor, the judge pressed. Any issue with verifying Officer Tanner's GPS logs? Brock's hesitation was just long enough. Long enough for the jury to notice. Long enough for the spectators in the gallery to shift forward in their seats. No objections, Your Honor, Brock finally said. But his voice was tighter now, strained. Xavier let out a quiet breath. He had studied prosecutors for years. He knew their tactics, their tricks, and there was one universal truth: when a prosecutor stalled, it meant they were hiding something. Judge Carter sighed, rubbing his temple. Fine. Let's move on while we wait for those records. Brock straightened his tie, regaining his composure. Your Honor, while we wait, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the store counter. Clear evidence that he was at the scene. Xavier nodded slowly, his face unreadable. That's true, he admitted. Brock smirked, thinking he'd won that exchange. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Xavier turned toward the jury, locking eyes with them. The prosecution wants you to believe that just because my fingerprints were on that counter, it means I committed a crime. But let's think about this logically. He took a breath, keeping his tone calm, controlled. Then he delivered his next blow. What if I told you that touching something doesn't make you a criminal? Xavier let the words settle, the weight of them sinking into the room. The jury was listening now. Really listening. Brock shifted in his seat, arms crossed, but Xavier could see the cracks forming in his confidence. You walk into a department store, Xavier said, keeping his voice even. You try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, zip it up, maybe even adjust the collar. Then you put it back on the rack and leave. A few hours later, someone steals that jacket." He paused, looking at the jurors. "If the police found your fingerprints on it, would that mean you stole it?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. The car in this case was parked outside a gas station for hours before the alleged robbery. I was there with my friends, grabbing snacks. And yeah, when we walked past the car, I leaned on it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. Didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car. Didn't steal anything." Xavier let his voice drop just slightly, letting the tension build. "But now, because my fingerprints were found, the prosecution wants you to believe that means I'm guilty." His gaze landed on Brock, watching the prosecutor fumble with his notes. "And while we're on the topic," Xavier continued, turning back to Judge Carter, "was the forensic specialist who examined these fingerprints subpoenaed to testify." Judge Carter blinked, caught off guard. He glanced at Brock. The prosecutor hesitated. Then finally he admitted, "No." And just like that, the courtroom shifted again. Xavier nodded slowly, his lips pressing together like he had just won a hand of poker. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice steady but cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "The prosecution is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence." The gallery murmured, the jury shifting uncomfortably. Brock tightened his jaw. "The forensic report is in the case file. The evidence speaks for itself." Xavier tilted his head. "Right, and we're all just supposed to take your word for it." Brock didn't answer. He didn't have to. The damage was done. Judge Carter sighed heavily. "Move on, Mr. Reed." Xavier took a slow step forward. "Gladly, Your Honor, because now I'd like to introduce evidence that was never submitted." The judge frowned. "What evidence?" Xavier reached into the folder he had been holding since the trial began, pulling out a single sheet of paper, a sworn statement from the owner of the convenience store. Xavier said, turning toward the jury, "Mr. Carl Whitman, the man who was actually robbed." Brock's face drained of color. Xavier unfolded the paper and read aloud, "I was behind the counter when the robbery happened. The man who held me at gunpoint wore a ski mask, but he had green eyes." Xavier's eyes met the jury. "I have brown eyes." The courtroom exploded in gasps and whispers, and in that moment, Xavier saw it. The moment the jury realized this entire case was built on nothing. The courtroom erupted in a wave of gasps and murmurs. Jurors exchanged looks, reporters scribbled furiously, and even the bailiff looked caught off guard. Judge Carter's gavel came down hard. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." But the damage was already done. Xavier stood tall, his face unreadable, but inside, he knew this was the moment everything shifted. Across the courtroom, Brock's grip on his pen tightened. He opened his mouth to object but hesitated. He had nothing. Xavier turned back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the only eyewitness in this case, the victim himself, gave a description that doesn't match me. Yet the prosecution never brought this to your attention. Why?" Brock pushed himself up from his chair. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was found near the scene." Xavier shook his head, cutting him off. "No, I wasn't." His voice didn't rise, but it carried across the room like a hammer. "I was blocks away walking home with my friends after buying snacks. The only thing tying me to this case is a bad police report and a prosecutor who was willing to overlook the truth just to win." Brock stiffened, his face flushed with frustration. Judge Carter exhaled loudly, rubbing his temple. He glanced at Brock, then at the jury, then at Xavier. The truth was sinking in for everyone. Xavier folded his arms. "Your Honor, at this point, I have to ask, what exactly is the state's case against me? Because from where I'm standing, there isn't one." And for the first time all morning, Judge Carter didn't have an answer. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. No more chuckles, no more smug glances, just the weight of truth pressing down on everyone in the room. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses, staring at Xavier like he was seeing him for the first time. Across the aisle, Brock flipped through his notes, his polished confidence now replaced by frustration. "The prosecution has presented a case based on assumptions," Xavier continued, his voice firm. "No real forensic analysis, no reliable eyewitness testimony, no actual evidence proving I committed this crime. His eyes locked on the jury. But let's talk about the evidence we do have. He held up the sworn statement, shaking it slightly for emphasis. The store owner himself saying that the man who robbed him had green eyes. I have brown eyes. The juror shifted uncomfortably. Another one crossed their arms, deep in thought. Judge Carter finally broke the silence. His voice was low, measured. Does the prosecution have anything further? Brock hesitated, jaw tight. He glanced at his notes, but everyone in the courtroom already knew he had nothing left. No, Your Honor. Judge Carter exhaled, rubbing his temple before looking back at Xavier. The court finds the defendant not guilty. Case dismissed. The gavel slammed. For a moment, the room stood still. Then chaos. The gallery erupted into whispers. Reporters rushed to take notes, and the bailiff stepped forward to restore order. But Xavier didn't move. He let it all sink in, because for the first time since this nightmare started, he was free. Xavier sat still for a moment, letting the weight of two simple words, case dismissed, sink in. It was over. But even as the bailiff called for order, the courtroom was already alive with noise. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, the gallery buzzed with shocked whispers, and the jurors exchanged glances, some relieved, some unsettled. Xavier slowly rose from his chair, rolling his shoulders, feeling the tension finally leave his body. He had won. But this wasn't just about him. He turned, eyes scanning the crowd until he found her. His mother, Denise Reed, stood at the back of the courtroom. Arms crossed, eyes glistening with unshed tears. She looked him up and down as if making sure he was real. Whole, free. Then she let out a long breath and shook her head. Boy, you about gave me a heart attack, she muttered, marching toward him. Xavier let out a breathless chuckle. Had to take a risk, Ma. She stared at him for a moment longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward as reporters crowded around. Xavier, how does it feel to have beaten the system? Did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? Xavier barely heard them, because across the room, Judge Carter was still sitting at the bench watching him. His expression was unreadable but different now. No longer dismissive, no longer amused. For the first time, Xavier had made the system look at itself, and for once, it blinked first. As Xavier stepped away from the reporters, the commotion in the courtroom slowly faded behind him. The cameras flashed, microphones jostled for his attention, but he wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. This was about something bigger. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother stood with arms crossed, a mixture of pride and relief on her face. Well, she asked, tilting her head. How does it feel to be a free man? Xavier exhaled, looking out over the sea of people, some celebrating, some still whispering in disbelief. It shouldn't have taken this much, he said quietly. Denise's expression softened, and she nodded. She knew. She had spent her whole life fighting the same fight. Across the street, Judge Carter stood by his car, watching. But this wasn't the same man who had sneered down at Xavier hours ago. The arrogance was gone. The casual dismissal had faded. Now, his posture was heavier. His gaze lingered just a little too long, like he was wrestling with something inside himself. Recognition, regret, maybe both. For him, this had been just another case, another routine conviction, another name on a docket. Except now he would remember this one, because Xavier had done something most defendants never got the chance to do. He made the system stop and look at itself. And for once, it was the system that backed down first. Xavier took a deep breath, then turned back to his mother. Come on, Ma, let's go home. But as he walked away, he already knew. His fight with the system wasn't over yet. As Xavier walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the moment settled deep in his chest. How many others had sat in that chair, without the knowledge to fight back? How many had been convicted, not because they were guilty, but because no one questioned the evidence? This wasn't just about him. It never was. He glanced back once, at the grand building where he had nearly lost everything. But next time he walked into a courtroom, it wouldn't be as a defendant. He'd be the attorney. And he wouldn't be the only one, because the system wouldn't change itself. People had to make it change. And Xavier Reed had just gotten started. Xavier Reed's story isn't just about one case. It's about countless cases where justice is assumed but never truly served. How many innocent people have been convicted simply because no one questioned the evidence? How often do assumptions replace facts, and convenience override truth? The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was built. But change doesn't happen on its own. It happens when people demand it. Knowledge is power. Xavier won because he understood the law better than those trying to use it against him. But what about the ones who don't? This isn't just his fight. It's ours. Because next time it might not be Xavier. It might be someone you know. And when that day comes, will the system blink first?